Hello and welcome to the Constitution Study, where we are returning the Constitution to we the people. My name is Paul Engel, and I want to thank you for joining me today. This is the very first episode, so I'm sure that most of you, this is your first exposure to the Constitution Study. I want to thank you for taking some time and listening to what's going on. I hope you'll find it interesting and educational and worth following. If this is not your first time listening, if you've listened to other episodes and have come back for more, kind of come back to see where things started, well, first of all, I'm happy because, well, you're here, and it doesn't hurt the fact that there were obviously other episodes for you to come back and listen to. But I'm also thankful because it is that type of dedication, that type of putting forth the effort to learn more about the Constitution that will help change this nation, help restore us to the constitutional republic we started out as. Most of all, help us to live free. You know, asked about this Constitution study, why I did that, I keep coming back to a story that reminds me of a lot of the interactions I have with people when I'm talking about the Constitution. The story goes like this. There was this teacher, and he had, well, let's just say a problem child, someone who just wasn't doing the work, wasn't involved, wasn't engaged. And at one point, he called the student out. He says, "Johnny, are you ignorant or just apathetic?" To which Johnny promptly replied, "I don't know, and I don't care." Well, unfortunately, today it seems that when you talk to people about the Constitution, their response is, "I don't know, and I don't care." And I have to admit, I was the same way for many, many years. For decades, I didn't know about the Constitution, and I didn't care about the Constitution. But then I came across this quote. If there's one saying, one quote that I think undergirds the Constitution study and why I'm become so passionate about it, it's a quote from John Jay. He said, "Every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country, and to teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them." And that's what the Constitution study is all about. It's understanding that, yes, there is ignorance, there is apathy, but if we read and study the Constitution, then we will know what our rights are. We'll know how they're to be defended. We will recognize when they have been violated and be prepared to defend and assert them. Most importantly, we will have the tools to teach the next generation, our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren, to be free. So I wanted to start out with a little history about me and about the Constitution study and where it came from. I am a product of the public school system, like I'm sure most of you are. For me, it was mostly in the 1970s, so yeah, you can guess a little bit about how long I've been around. And, I admit it, I learned more about the Constitution from Schoolhouse Rock than I did in 12 years of government-run education. Let's face it, history, as it's taught in the schools, is boring. Actually, in my case, they didn't even teach history. They taught social studies. And it was boring. It was names and dates and places and memorization, and what little we learned about the Constitution just, really wasn't there. There was very little. So I grew up thinking the Constitution was this big, complicated document that needed to be left to lawyers and judges since they were obviously the only ones that could understand it. Then one day I stumbled across a gentleman by the name of David Barton and his organization, WallBuilders. And I learned a couple things that are very important. One thing I learned was it's not what you don't know that hurts you, but what you know that just isn't so. See, through Mr. Barton, I began to learn just how much I didn't know about the Constitution. More importantly, I learned how much that I actually, quote, knew about it that just wasn't true. It wasn't so. Now, this is not just opinion. WallBuilders and Mr. Barton has, as I understand it, the largest private collection of original documents from our founding era. And he uses these documents. Mr. Barton and WallBuilders show what our founding fathers said, what they had established, why they set up the government the way they did, how they expected it to work, how they designed it to work, and how it actually did work for almost 150 years. Now, yes, there were problems and there were issues, but for that first 150 years of our nation, we kind of followed the way the Constitution was designed and the way it had designed our government to work. So when I learned about the John Jay quote, it really touched me, this idea of reading and studying, because I've done that before, not for the Constitution, but I've studied for work, I've studied for church. I like going back to original documents, so I was encouraged to actually read and study more. I read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And as I heard people talking about that, they often refer to this thing called the Federalist Papers. So I found them and I read them. And in looking for the Federalist Papers, I found, hey, there are Anti-Federalist Papers. I don't know about you, but I had never heard of these before. So I found them and I read them as well. And I sought out others who could teach me about our Constitution and our founding. And I always went back and checked them against those original documents. And the best part is everything I've mentioned, all those documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, the papers, and more are available for free online. You don't have to go to a store and buy these. You don't have to go to a law library. You can find them for free on the internet. And it's those original documents that are important. Think about it. If you sign a contract, whether it's a contract for a job or with somebody to do some work on your house, you expect them to abide by the letter of the contract, what it actually says. Yet it seems today we don't pay attention to the words of the Constitution. We seem to be paying more attention to what people say about the words of the Constitution. And I'm sure my friends and family were starting to wonder about what was going on with me. Why did I suddenly find this old document so interesting, so important, so much that I wanted to talk about it? Then it happened. I was driving home from a Bible study one night, listening to WallBuilders. In fact, it was an episode about a report that had come out called The State of the First Amendment 2013. Now, this is from the First Amendment Center. Now, there was a lot of good information in this report, but the statistic that really grabbed my attention, the one that really got me, was this. 36% of those surveyed could not name a single freedom protected by the First Amendment. Think about that for a second. If this is a representation of the nation as a whole, more than 1/3 of Americans have no idea where their freedoms come from, how they are protected, and where to go to defend them. Remind you of John Jay's quote? This is a perfect example of what happens when we ignore it. If we don't read and study, we don't know where our freedoms are protected. We don't even know what our freedoms are. Now, I have to admit, I don't remember much of the rest of the episode. I was frustrated. I was angry. The point where you're kind of talking to yourself in the car and you hope people aren't looking in too closely. I was frustrated at how our schools have failed us. How we have been failed by previous generations to teach us about our freedoms, about our history, about the Constitution. And I also began to be frustrated at how we were failing the next generation. Then I had a thought. Couldn't we study the Constitution the way I had just studied the Bible? Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Bible studies, the best ones, in my opinion, are the ones where people get together and they read the Bible and they're trying to understand the words on the page and the context of what's actually being said, and they're trying to apply it to their lives. They're looking to understand what is it telling them and how are they telling them how to live their life. Now, these are generally open discussions. Everybody's allowed to bring their opinion. Everybody's allowed to talk. But what's important is it's the words on the page that we're trying to understand. So it's not the opinions that are most important. It's taking those opinions and understanding what the word actually says. Well, why don't we do that with the Constitution? Why don't we get together and read and study the Constitution? Understand the words on the page. Understand the context in which they were written and what our founding fathers told us in their writings they were doing and why. Why don't we? Now, I've had some pretty harebrained schemes in my day, and I thought this might be one of those wild ideas, so I did what any smart husband does. I went and talked to my wife about it. And as a hopefully relatively smart man, I went and talked to my friends about it, and everybody kind of said, yeah, that's an interesting idea. With that kind of look like, it sounds interesting, but I don't quite know what it is you're talking about. One friend, however, she took the bull by the horns. She went down to the local library. We were living in upstate New York at the time in a very small town, but we had a public library, and she went there and said, hey, we want to have a Constitution study. We want to have it here. So after we discussed the study and what we were trying to do with the librarian, she said, sure. We set a date. We started putting out signs saying, hey, come to the Constitution study. And there I was. I had a couple weeks to take this vague idea of studying the Constitution and turn it into something real. And then there it was. It was that first night. I was at the library with my daughter. She's watching me pace back and forth in the meeting room because, let's face it, who wants to listen to what I have to say about the Constitution? Who's going to show up to discuss this with somebody? I mean, I've got no history degree. I'm not a professor. I haven't written books. I have no scholarly leg to stand on to say, come listen to me about the Constitution. I had learned you don't need that. Through my own study and experience, I had learned you don't need that, but would other people come and listen? Well, a couple friends showed up, and that was good. At least I wouldn't be talking to myself and my daughter. Then a couple of other people, and somebody who'd seen a sign we'd put out, and a couple more who'd heard by word of mouth. And by the time it was the designated start time, well, there were about 15 people sitting around a table looking at me going, okay, buddy, what's a Constitution study? Well, they didn't say that, but I could see it in their eyes. So I asked them the question from the First Amendment Foundation. I asked them if they could name the 5 freedoms listed in the First Amendment. The 5 freedoms are protected by the First Amendment. Now stop and listen for a second. If you have to, pause the podcast and see if you can name, without looking, all 5 freedoms that are listed in the First Amendment, that are protected by the First Amendment. Now, when I asked this question at the study, I got the answer I expected. They got a couple. One person actually got 4. I was rather impressed, but nobody got all 5. And in fact, many of the things they listed, some of them weren't in the First Amendment. They were in other parts of the Constitution. Some weren't even in the Constitution at all. So that's when I said, this is why we're here. We want to read and study the Constitution. We want to follow that John Jay quote. We told them that discussion was open. Everybody had a voice to speak and to contribute and to ask questions and to be interactive. But our foundation, the one thing we were trying to do was read and understand the Constitution as it was written. And for the next 9 months, every other week, 90 minutes a time, we got together and we read and studied the Constitution. And it was great. We usually had about 10 to 15 people show up every session. Some people came back. Some people came in and out. But we had a great time. And the things I remember the most were the questions. See, pretty much every session, I got these 2 questions asked in some form or another. The first was, well, if the Constitution says this, why do we do that? That's why we're here, right? That's why we're there, to learn and understand what the Constitution actually said. The other question, which is harder to answer, is, well, how do we fix it? That was often a long and drawn-out discussion, but it came down to participation. It came down to education. It came down to, let's no longer be ignorant. Let's understand what the Constitution actually says. Let's be able to engage in discussion about it, especially with our elected officials. And then let's no longer be apathetic. Let's actually apply what we know about the Constitution to the people who are representing us. Well, you may have noticed I said we spent 9 months, and there's a reason why we spent 9 months. Reason number 1 was, well, that's how long it took us to get through the Constitution. All 7 articles, all 27 amendments, including the preambles, we did in 9 months. The other reason was personal. See, I moved. I'd lived in upstate New York almost all of my life. I'd lived in New York State at that point my entire life, and I couldn't handle it anymore. New York is known as the Empire State, and I will tell you from living there for so many decades, it's earned that reputation. It was run like an empire. And I wanted to move my family to a free state. And between that desire to move and my work opportunities, I ended up living in Middle Tennessee. I moved down here and I don't know anybody. I don't have the friends I had back in New York. So once I settled in, I started mentioning, the Constitution study. And I kind of got that, that sounds kind of interesting. Have you talked to so-and-so? But no real engagement, right? No one really seemed to be stepping up and say, yes, I would like to participate in something like this. And it was part of me that thought, I want more. I think there's more here. I think there's something else. So after a couple of years and trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I had some time on my hands. And I thought, hey, I'll write a book. If nothing else, that I can get all these ideas that are bouncing around in my head from what I have learned, and I can put them on paper. I can get them out. Who knows? I may even be able to sell this book and share some information. So I started writing. I mean, let's face it, all it's going to cost me is my time to write this book. And I started writing it, and I started getting busy, but there was still more I wanted to do. See, as I'm writing portions of the book, I'm getting these great ideas. And I'm like, I don't want to wait for the whole book to be finished. There's some ideas in here that really should be out, and they should be out now. So I thought, well, if I want to take these and turn them into essays and get them out on the net, I need to set up a website. I'm a computer geek by trade, so setting up a website is no big deal. I got a website set up, and I started posting a few blog posts and working on a couple of essays, and I liked the idea, but I thought there was still more. See, then I started looking at, well, what else could I do? What could I do to share this information and hopefully find a few people that were as interested in learning as I was? So here's where we sit now. I'm working on the book. I have the website. The website is constitutionstudy.com. If you go there, you can find articles and blog posts, and, you'll find this podcast, and it's information around the study. I'm also working on publishing a couple of essays. One I'm working on, I plan to publish soon, is How the 16th and 17th Amendment Destroyed the Republic. Hopefully that would get your attention. I'm working on things about myths about the Constitution and several other ideas that keep bouncing around in my head. But what I want to do with the podcast, and I held off quite a while before doing the podcast, because if I'm going to do the podcast right, if I'm going to set up a mailing list and actually get the podcast out on iTunes and start working this, I'm actually going to start to cost money. So before I did that, again, like a smart husband, I went and talked to my wife about it, and we agreed this is a good way to go. We could get started. We can see if there's interest to move this Constitution from my idea in my head in a small group that I don't even know if they're still meeting back in upstate New York, and actually get it out to where people in America and even the world could learn more about the Constitution. So here's what I decided to do. As I'm writing this book, I'm researching and I'm coming up with interesting thoughts and ideas, and it really has changed the way I think about my government, politics, my role as a citizen, what my responsibilities are, and how we're supposed to interact, both at the state and the federal level. I find it interesting. I listen to people who have studied the Constitution, people who are lawyers or constitutional professors, and sometimes I agree with them a lot of what I've heard from certain people, but not always. And I'm finding these points of view very interesting to research. So what I want to do with the podcast is I want to talk to you about it. I want to come on here and describe what I am learning while I'm writing this book. The things that excite me, the things that frustrate me, the new insights, things I had never thought of, and I want to bring them out into the podcast. I'm also going to write blog posts about them. So if you prefer to read than listen, or if you want to share some of these ideas, you'll be able to. You'll have the tools to go and share them. But most of all, what I really want to do is I want to answer questions. I'm hoping that you will go to the website, go to constitutionstudy.com. There's a spot there where you can ask a question, and I get the chance to answer it. And if it's a really good question, I'll make a podcast episode out of it. And if it's a really, really good question, I'll have you on the podcast. I'll have you call in, and we can do an interview where we can discuss your ideas, your question on the podcast. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Here's my call to action. I want you to continue to listen to the podcast. Find out what's going on. Read the Constitution. Learn what's going on. If you have ideas, I've had the idea brought up, and I'm not sure how I want to do that, of having an online study, either via podcast or via a webcast of some sort, where we can kind of simulate what I was doing in upstate New York. What I really want you to do is go onto the website, ask questions, make comments, see what's there. Tell me what I'm missing. Tell me what I'm explaining that doesn't quite come across. And again, I want those questions. I want you to challenge my thoughts and ideas, because that's how we really find the truth. I know a lot of people who they want the ditto head. They want someone that just says, yes, I agree exactly with what you're saying. Yes. And I'll tell you what, that is quite the ego stroke. I understand why people want to be agreed with, but I also want the challenge. When we're doing the Constitution study, there were several things that we were talking about that got challenged. Sometimes it was little things that we discussed. Sometimes it was larger aspects of it. And sometimes I looked at my point of view and said, maybe I'm not exactly right. But the important thing was we discussed it. And it's something I think we're missing in society today. We don't have open and free discussions. We end up yelling at each other. We end up defending our point of view against all comers. And then you don't end up learning. You just end up reinforcing your own biases. So please go online, ask questions, join my mailing list. You'll see a form where you can fill out. And I'm not spamming, but I will tell you when things come out, like when I'm releasing essays, or if I'm releasing any new podcasts or events, I will let you know. By the way, if you sign up for the website, if you sign up for the mailing list, I will send you a copy of all my essays as they're released. Everybody on the mailing list gets a copy of my essays emailed to them directly. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you understand a little bit now where I'm coming from, what I'm trying to do, why I'm spending the time writing the book, hosting the website, recording these podcasts, why I find it so important. Ronald Reagan said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Think about that. How many generations has it been since we've actually read and studied the Constitution? But according to Reagan, we're never more than one generation away from losing our freedoms. He continues, we didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like to live in the United States where men were free. If you look at society today, we're losing our freedoms. And in many cases, we're handing them over. And that's because we aren't learning about them. We aren't passing them on. So that's part of my call as well. Learn, understand, teach the rising generation. Remember, as John Adams said, he said, I must study politics and war that our sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. Well, I've decided I must study the Constitution that my daughter may have the liberty to study mathematics or philosophy or anything else she wants, and to do so in a land that truly is the land of the free and the home of the brave. So I hope you'll join me. I hope you found this interesting. And I ask that you, again, go to the website, constitutionstudy.com. And I hope to see you next time, or hope to hear me next time on the next episode of the Constitution Study Podcast. Remember, we must read and study so that we may continue to be free. Thank you.